The Queen's funeral procession was in full motion until the royal guard suddenly broke formation in front of the entire nation. So why did he do it? To find out, first hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. That being said, let's get into it. The polished black boots of Lance Corporal William Evans remained perfectly still against the grey pavement of London streets. His scarlet tunic stood in stark contrast to the sea of black surrounding him, the gold buttons and white belt gleaming, despite the overcast sky that seemed fitting for the somber occasion. His bare skin cap added nearly a foot to his already impressive height, making him a sentinel visible even from a distance. Evans kept his eyes fixed forward, his white-gloved hands firmly gripping his rifle in the ceremonial position. 15 years of service in the Queen's Guard had perfected his ability to remain motionless for hours, his face betraying nothing of the thoughts that might lurk beneath the surface. Even on this day, perhaps especially on this day, his discipline would not falter. The Queen's funeral procession would begin momentarily, and Evans stood at his assigned post along the route, part of the honor guard that would maintain vigil as Her Majesty made her final journey through London's streets. The silence that had fallen over the gathered crowds was unlike anything Evans had experienced in his years of service, a profound quiet that seemed to hold the very breath of the nation. The procession moved with meticulous precision, each element choreographed down to the second. The gun carriage bearing the Queen's coffin draped in the royal standard with the imperial state crown resting atop was drawn by sailors of the Royal Navy, an ancient tradition dating back to Queen Victoria's funeral. Evans maintained his position. His eyes permitted only the slightest movement to scan the gathered crowds, a security measure drilled into every guard. It was during one such scan that he noticed Captain Mason Croft standing rigidly at his command position several yards away. Croft's reputation preceded him throughout the regiment. A 25-year veteran, Croft was known as a man who would sooner face a firing squad than bend a single rule of protocol. His piercing gaze continuously swept over the guards under his command, searching for the slightest imperfection. The absolute silence required of the guards during state ceremonies had become second nature to Evans. Even their breathing was controlled, slow, measured, invisible to observers. As the procession drew closer, Evans could make out the royal family members walking behind the coffin, their faces composed yet marked with grief. The Queen had reigned for so long that most people couldn't remember a time before her, including Evans himself, who had been born decades into her reign. It was then, as Evans continued his disciplined scan of the crowd, that his eyes fell upon an elderly man struggling to maintain his position several rows back from the barriers. The man's thin frame seemed to waver slightly, jostled by the gentle movements of the crowd. Despite the distance and the sea of faces, Evans recognized him instantly. Declan Shaw, the Queen's personal footman for over 6 decades. Shaw's weathered face bore the lines of a life spent in devoted service. Even now, despite his obvious physical frailty, he had dressed immaculately in a dark suit with a black tie, his silver hair combed neatly back in the same style he had maintained throughout his years at the palace. Evans noted how much older Shaw looked than when they had last spoken just 8 months prior. The illness had clearly accelerated. A memory surfaced in Evans's mind. His first week as a newly assigned guard at Buckingham Palace, standing at attention outside the royal apartments, still adjusting to the grueling demands of the position. Shaw had been carrying a silver tray of tea things, moving with the silent efficiency that characterized the royal household staff. The older man had noticed Evans's almost imperceptible discomfort after 4 hours at his post, and had paused just long enough to whisper, "Wiggle your toes inside your boots, lad. No one can see, and it keeps the blood flowing." That small kindness had been the beginning of an unlikely friendship between the young guard and the aging royal servant. Over the years, their paths had crossed frequently within the palace walls, their brief interactions growing into a mutual respect that transcended the different nature of their service to the crown. During his first summer as a guard, Evans had encountered Shaw in one of the palace service corridors during his brief rest period. The young guard had thanked the footman for his advice, which had indeed helped him endure his shift. 62 years I've walked these halls, Shaw had told him, inviting Evans to join him for tea in the staff quarters, served under 3 monarchs, though this queen has been my life's work. Over steaming cups in the quiet corner of the staff kitchen, Shaw had shared stories that brought the palace to life in ways Evans had never considered. The footman described the young princess who became queen overnight, her shoulders suddenly bearing the weight of empire. She asked about my mother when she was ill, Shaw had said, his eyes distant with memory. In the middle of the Suez crisis, with the Prime Minister calling every hour, she remembered my mother was in hospital and asked how she was faring. That's the measure of who she is. The footman had never married, devoting himself entirely to royal service. The palace staff had become his family, the queen the center of his world. In his final years of service, as arthritis began to null Shaw's once nimble fingers, the queen had personally insisted he transition to lighter duties rather than retire completely, recognizing his devotion. The memory that pressed most insistently on Evans's mind now was from just 2 years prior. He had encountered Shaw at a palace garden party. The retired footman invited as a special guest in recognition of his service. They had found a quiet moment away from the crowds, standing beside a flowering cherry tree. The doctors say it's spreading, Shaw had said without preamble, his voice matter-of-fact rather than seeking sympathy. Pancreatic, not the good kind, if there is such a thing. A gentle breeze had scattered cherry blossoms around them as Shaw looked up at the palace windows. I've served Her Majesty my entire life, been present at every significant moment of her reign that occurred within these walls. When the time comes, he had paused, his voice dropping. When the time comes for her final journey, I fear I may not be able to be properly present to pay my respects as I should. My nephew will take me, of course, but he doesn't understand. The crowds will be enormous in my condition. Shaw's eyes had met Evans's directly. If that day comes, and I'm still here, but unable to secure a proper position, would you help an old man say goodbye to his queen? I give you my word, Mr. Shaw, Evans had replied, his voice carrying the weight of a formal oath. If that day comes, I'll ensure you can pay your proper respects. A promise that now pressed upon Evans's conscience as he watched Shaw struggle in the crowd. The procession was drawing nearer, the solemn music growing louder. Shaw's face reflected a quiet desperation as he attempted to find a gap between the spectators. He tried to shift sideways, but was hemmed in by the density of the crowd. For a moment he seemed to sway slightly, one hand reaching out to steady himself against the shoulder of a stranger. The other hand pressed against his side, a gesture Evans recognized from their last meeting, when Shaw had admitted the pain was sometimes overwhelming. No one in the crowd seemed to notice the elderly man's predicament. All eyes were drawn to the approaching procession. Shaw was invisible to them, just as he had been for decades of service, moving silently through palace corridors, present but unseen. Evans's duty was clear: maintain position, remain motionless, embody the discipline and tradition of the guard during this sacred state occasion. The penalty for breaking formation during a royal funeral procession would be severe, possibly the end of his military career, certainly the end of his time with the Queen's Guard. 15 years of spotless service, potentially erased by a single decision. Yet the promise he had made weighed equally heavy. Not merely a casual oath, but a soldier's word given to a man who had devoted his entire life to the same institution Evans had sworn to serve. Evans could see Shaw attempting once more to find a viewing position, his thin frame now leaning heavily against a barrier, his breath coming in visible gasps. The procession was less than 50 yards away. In moments it would pass, and Shaw would miss his final opportunity to properly bid farewell to the monarch he had served for over 60 years. Evans's breathing changed slightly, the only outward sign of his internal struggle.
His eyes flicked briefly toward Captain Croft, who was focused intently on the approaching procession, then back to shore. The coffin was now 30 yards away, 20 yards. Evans drew a slightly deeper breath, his decision crystallizing with the clarity that often comes in moments of crisis. 15 years of training had taught him when rules must be followed absolutely. It had also taught him when they must be broken. With the precision that had characterized his entire career, Evans executed a perfect about-face. The same movement performed countless times during ceremonial duty, but now performed at a moment when absolute stillness was required. The motion was so clean, so professional, that for a split second it might have appeared to be part of some predetermined protocol unknown to the public. That illusion shattered as he took his first step away from his post. He moved with deliberate efficiency, neither rushing nor hesitating. His white-gloved hands maintained their proper grip on his rifle, his posture remaining parade ground perfect as he cut a straight line through the crowd toward shore. The precision of his movement created a natural parting in the mass of people who instinctively gave way before the unexpected approach of the scarlet-clad figure. From the corner of his eye, Evans caught the reaction of the nearest guards. They maintained their positions, but he could sense their shock in the subtle stiffening of their already rigid postures. Captain Croft's face came into Evans's line of sight. The man's expression transformed from confusion to disbelief to fury in the space of seconds. His eyes widened, then narrowed dangerously, his jaw clenching so tightly that a muscle jumped visibly along his temple. Evans reached shore in 7 precisely measured steps. The elderly man looked up in astonishment as the guard's tall figure appeared before him. "Lance Corporal Evans," Shaw whispered, confusion evident in his rheumy eyes. Without speaking, speech would have been a further breach of protocol. Evans extended his left arm while maintaining his grip on his rifle with his right. With the same ceremonial dignity he would have used to escort a visiting dignitary, he gently guided Shaw forward through the crowd which parted respectfully before them. Evans positioned the elderly man at the very front of the spectators, directly adjacent to his now vacant post. Here Shaw would have an unobstructed view of the procession just as it passed. The elderly man's legs trembled slightly, and Evans smoothly adjusted his stance to provide support. "You kept your promise, lad," Shaw murmured, his voice barely audible above the funeral march. "She deserved your farewell, sir," Evans replied, his voice equally low, his eyes now fixed forward as the coffin approached their position. For 3 heartbeats, no more, they stood together, the young guard and the ancient servant, as the Queen's coffin passed before them. Shaw managed to straighten his stooped posture for that brief moment, his hand coming up in a final salute that spoke of decades of devoted service. Then, with the same military precision that had marked his departure, Evans guided Shaw back to a secure standing position among respectful bystanders and returned to his post. His movement back into position was so flawlessly executed that it seemed almost a continuation of his earlier action, a perfect ceremonial circle now complete. As he resumed his stance, the enormity of what he had just done settled upon him like the weight of the bearskin cap he wore. He had broken the most sacred protocol of the guard during the most solemn ceremony imaginable. Yet his face betrayed nothing, as the procession continued past. From his peripheral vision, he could see Shaw now standing comfortably with a clear view, supported by the considerate spectators. Captain Croft remained at his position, but the fury in his expression had crystallized into something cold and immovable. The remaining guards maintained their perfect formation, though Evans was acutely aware of the subtle tension that had spread through their ranks. The procession completed its solemn journey down the route. Only when the last official participant had passed and the crowds began to disperse, did Captain Croft finally approach, his movements stiff with contained fury. "Lance Corporal Evans," he said, his voice pitched low, but carrying the weight of authority. "You will report to headquarters immediately following the conclusion of today's ceremonial duties. Your attendance is required at a disciplinary hearing." "Yes, sir," Evans replied, his voice steady, his eyes forward. When the final ceremonial duties concluded 3 hours later, Evans found 2 senior guards waiting to escort him to headquarters. As they turned onto the quieter street leading to headquarters, Evans caught sight of Shaw in the distance. The elderly man was helped into a black cab by a younger relative. Before the door closed, Mr. Shaw turned and met Evans's eyes, offering a faint wave salute. At headquarters, Evans was brought before Colonel Hargreaves, Captain Croft, and 2 senior officers. "I've read the preliminary report on your conduct during today's state funeral," the colonel said. "Before we proceed, I want your account." Evans explained Shaw's decades of royal service, his terminal cancer, and the promise he'd made. "Today was his last chance to pay his respects, sir. I accept full responsibility for leaving my post." "You abandoned formation at a state funeral," Croft snapped. "Our most significant ceremony in years." "The seriousness of the breach is understood," Hargreaves said quietly. Evans waited in an anteroom until he was recalled. This time Lady Victoria Hamilton from the royal household sat with the officers. She outlined Shaw's 60 years of service and 4 personal decorations from the Queen, then produced a note from a senior royal praising Evans's actions and asking the regiment to consider the circumstances. The next morning, Evans faced Hargreaves again. "You will forfeit 2 weeks' pay and perform extra ceremonial duties," the colonel said. "This breach will appear in your record, but your actions also reflected the deeper duty of loyalty and respect Her Majesty valued." He handed Evans a small envelope, "A personal note of thanks from the royal household, for you and Mr. Shaw." Later, Evans read it aloud in Shaw's flat. The old man's eyes shone. "Worth it then," he whispered. "Without question, Mr. Shaw," Evans replied. "It was an honor to keep my promise." Have you seen someone break rules for the right reasons? What would you have done in Evans's place? Share your thoughts below and subscribe for more stories like this.